That happened when? In the time of Umar al-Khattab. Give me an estimate, year-wise. It's 18 after the Hijrah, approximately. So I'd put it like 6 something, right? Anybody? Say it again. It's around 16 to 18 Hijri, if I'm not mistaken. But that, what is that Gregorian? 637. Number 4, the plague of Amwas that afflicted the greater area of Syria, Lebanon. Over 25,000 Muslims died. Number 5, abundance of wealth, right? That happened in, it's one of the recurring signs that happened in limited fashions in different khilafas, but the greatest time will be in the time of Al-Mahdi. We'll get to that eventually. Number 6, the fitan. General fitan, as a general idea that fitan will afflict the ummah, trials and tribulations. And then some specific ones like the fitna between the Sahaba, the killing of Uthman and Ali, and the grandchildren of the Prophet ﷺ, which we didn't get to. Huge blemishes in the history of our ummah. Number 7, following the example of previous nations and previous religions to the T, making the same mistakes they make. And number 8 that we finished with last week, false prophets. Give me some of them. What? Musaylim al-Kadhab, his wife Sajah, called Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, Elijah Muhammad, the one person that was from Yemen, Tulayh al-Asadi. There was a lot more, but these are the few that we covered. This isn't the file. Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Umar. SubhanAllah, I knew this would happen. Anyway, we'll improvise. Just pretend there's elevator music for now. Elevator nasheed. I knew this would happen and I did nothing different. What does that mean, guys? That's true. You're the man. You're not a man? Okay. So it's going to be a little bit, we'll be fine. Bismillah. So we're continuing with sign number 8 now, number 9. And it is intishar al-amn, the widespread peace that will be all over the ummah. So I kind of lost the file here, but okay, we'll be okay. We'll just be a little bit briefer than usual. You guys will be fine, inshallah. So it's the spread of peace. And there's many ahadith that foretold this. In one narration, Khabbab ibn al-Arat, he comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he was reclining on the Kaaba, on a cloak of his. And Khabbab at this point, it's around 6-7 years into prophethood. And Khabbab is one of the earliest Muslims. And once he was sitting with Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with them both and all of the Sahaba. And Umar said, مَا أَحَدْ أَحَقُّ بِهَذَا الْمَجْلِسِ مِنْ بِلَالٍ. There's nobody who's more deserving to be sitting with us than Bilal. Bilal's the man because of what he went through for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. None of you can match what Bilal went through. So Khabbab stood up and he said, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, I want to show you something." And he took off his shirt and he turned his back. And they saw that his back was one black piece like leather from the top to the bottom. So they just said, what on earth is this? What are you showing us? What's wrong with your skin? And he said, my owners in Mecca when I was a slave, they would light hot coals in the desert. And nothing would put out those hot coals except the skin of my back. Just for my belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is background. So when you hear what he's about to tell the Prophet ﷺ, you don't think that, oh yeah, just be patient or he could be a little stronger. No, it was real trial and tribulation that they went through. So it's in this context that he comes to Rasulullah ﷺ and he tells him, أَلَا تَسْتَنصِرُ لَنَا أَلَا تَدْعُ اللَّهَ لَنَا. Will you not seek victory for us, seek aid? Will you not make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieves us? We're here in Mecca like sitting ducks. These people are attacking us, they're torturing us, they're killing some people. Like Ammar and his family, they killed his whole family except for him. And we're going through this intense tribulation and trials and torture. Why don't you make dua that Allah gives us victory? So he says the Prophet ﷺ sat up. And he got up and he was annoyed at the question. And he said, the people before you, nations before you in faith, they would be taken. And one of them, a saw was put at the top of his head. And he was commanded to give up this faith. Commanded to abandon this faith. And if he refused, he was sawed in half. And another, a pit was dug for him and he was thrown into that fire. And another, they would put him and they would comb off his skin with combs of iron until the skin was separated from the muscle, from the bone, from the nerves, taking them to pieces. وَلَا يَرُدُّهُ ذَلِكَ عَنْ دِينِهِ. And none of them gave up their faith. None of them threw in the towel. And I swear, he said after this, وَاللَّهِ لَيُتِمَنَّ اللَّهُ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ. I swear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring this matter to its resolution. It's going to complete. We're going to be victorious. وَلَكِنَّكُمْ قَوْمٌ تَسْتَعْجِلُونَ. But you're in a hurry. And it will come to fruition such that, he said, the woman would leave from Sana'a or from Hadramaut, going to the Kaaba, not fearing anything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the wolf against her sheep. Meaning she doesn't have to worry about this path. Especially in that time where there's highway robbers, there's a bunch of people waiting for lonely travelers to attack. He's saying that's not going to be the case one day, where the woman on her own would be free to travel, come to Mecca, go back hundreds of miles, days and weeks of travel, and there will be no fear except of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's going to bring about a level of peace and serenity and security that you don't expect, but you're in a rush. You're hasty people. You're consumed by your own current trials and tribulations such that you can't see the big picture. You're unable. You're unable to see the big picture because of you being absolutely consumed by this. Your point of view, your own view of the world, your own perception. Everybody's their own main character and that's all you see. That's all you think about. But that's not all that there is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a vision and He has a plan, but you are people who are in a rush. In another hadith, he said in similar things, and he used different cities to show the expanse of the ummah and how much it would grow to reach this prophecy that he's teaching the Sahaba. So he's using this to tell them what? What's he trying to tell the Sahaba in this situation? Have hope. What else? Well, no worries is not really going to work. They're being tortured. Right? People are in dark times, so no worries wouldn't work. Have hope, definitely. But also be patient. It's not don't worry or don't feel pain, but be patient and persevere through it. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a master plan that you may or may not be a part of, but that will come to fruition. So this piece was seen from the beginning of the time of Umar ibn Khattab, where people were able to travel freely, where all these lands became Muslim lands, and the ummah was experiencing this peace where people could travel freely and had the ability to go about the lands with no passport except La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. That they can go at one point from Azerbaijan to Morocco. And as long as they were Muslims, they had that security, and even non-Muslims. In fact, as we said before, in the time of Umar al-Khattab, the majority of Christians live in Muslim lands. The majority of Christians of the world are living in Muslim lands. So the beginning of this peace happened in the time of Umar, and its full extent will be in the time of the Mahdi, where he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he will fill the earth with peace and serenity and justice, just as it had been previously filled with injustice and oppression. And that will be the height of it right before his advent, that we'll get to eventually, inshallah. Just a second, technical difficulties. Who knows a good nasheed? That's a good filler material. That would not be good filler material. Another sign that we didn't mention but was also part of the fitan that I wanted to just pass by quickly was the appearance of the Khawarij. So this was the first sect in Islam that broke off from the main body of the Ummah, and they appeared towards the time of Uthman. Their prototypes were the people that... Somebody didn't read their card today. Something's going on. They were the same people who surrounded him. It's static from my beard. They're the same people who surrounded his home and demanded that he step down from the Khilafah. They eventually assassinate him. And then they re-emerge, they regroup in the time of Ali, and they end up assassinating him as well. And they're people, what's important about them is that they're people who claim to be doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the sake of justice. And the Prophet ﷺ foretold them, where he said there will be a group of people that emerge in this ummah, that one of you would belittle your prayer if you compared it to theirs, and belittle your fasting when you compare it to theirs, and belittle your recitation of the Quran when you compare it to theirs. They read more Quran than you, they fast more than you, they pray more than you. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about the recital though, لا يجاوز حناجرهم. It doesn't pass their throats. Their recital is just sound. Doesn't reflect in their actions or in their beliefs or in their hearts. He said, يمرقون من الدين. They exit through the deen. كما يمرق السهم من الرمية. The same way that an arrow would go through its target. And he said in another hadith, it has no remnants of the creature on it. There's no blood, it just goes straight through. A really sharp arrow, think of it like a bullet, fired through a creature, it goes right through. So what do you think that implies, that metaphor? Okay? So it's the force. The metaphor is actually the force. That's their problem, the force with which they approach the deen. They're so forceful about it. They're so aggressive with it that it gets them right through the deen. They go right through it. And like you said, they take none of the remnants with them. There's no resemblance of what Islam actually is in their character or in the way that they hold themselves. So it's an important reminder for us, as he said in another hadith, that this deen will not be accomplished with shiddah, with strength. Somebody, meaning with aggressiveness. Somebody who tries to accomplish it all or forcefully apply it all, it will break him. It's something that has to be taken through learning, through progression, through different stages, one at a time. It has to be done in this fashion, or else it won't be done properly. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that anyone who tries to take it through this fashion, this aggressive fashion, it'll end up being a detriment to them and to those around them. The next sign is a fire that he foretold, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in a hadith, لا تقوم الساعة حتى تخرج نار من أرض الحجاز تضيء أعناق الإبل ببصرة. The hour will not come until a fire erupts in the Arabian Peninsula that will illuminate the necks of the camels in Basra, all the way in Iraq. Or another narration, Busra, which is in Syria. And this happened around 654 Hijri, which is like 1200 something. It's in the mid-1200s, the mid-13th century. It was a large volcano that happened near Medina in an area called Harrat al-Rahat. And it's a Medina surrounded by volcanic land that has been largely inactive for millennia. But there was a large volcano that was recorded, and it's even, you could look it up in volcano websites that track or have the record of large volcanic eruptions throughout the centuries. And it was in the 7th century Hijri, like I said, 654, and it continued for over 50 days, where it was erupting, and that they said that it made the towns as if they had lamps in them. So, like we were saying in the very beginning, a lot of the signs are negative, but this one is not intrinsically negative, right? It's not about negative human behavior, but it's still a reminder, because when these things would happen, the Prophet ﷺ taught us to rush towards worship, to rush towards remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like the example we have in his own seerah when the sun was eclipsed. And this was right after the death of his son Ibrahim. So he has an infant son, 1 or 2 years old, and he dies. And on that same day there's an eclipse, a solar eclipse. So the Sahaba, they say the sun eclipsed because of the death of Ibrahim. It's morning. And they said he came out of his home, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rushing to put on his izar, meaning he's still putting on his clothes. And he's telling them, rush towards prayer, because the sun and the moon are signs of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They do not eclipse for the birth or the death of anyone. So he taught them the eclipse prayer, Salat al-Khusuf, where the Prophet taught us that for the duration of these events, we make a special salah. And it's for the entire duration of these eclipses. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us to rush towards Him in repentance. That these things are in His hands, they're in His control, and He commands them as He wills. And something very also that we can glean from this is proof of His prophethood. How is this proof of the Prophet ﷺ's truthfulness? Yeah, Ahmed. Not talking about the volcanic eruption, that's true, but I'm talking about the eclipses. He could have used it as an opportunity to say, yeah, you guys are right. The sorrow that I feel is so intense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making it eclipse out of mourning. That would have been a perfect opportunity for a false prophet to say, yeah, you guys are right. That's exactly what's happening. But instead he said, the sun and the moon do not eclipse for the birth or death of anyone. Has nothing to do with Ibrahim's death, as sad as I feel, as moved as I am at this moment. It is a sign of the might of Allah, and He is reminding us of His ability. And in that case, we should rush towards repentance, because He could turn these things against us. He could make these natural occurrences or phenomena turn against us very easily. They were used as forms of punishing previous nations. Isn't that true? Earthquakes and rainfall and floods. But instead, He is reminding us of His might, and it is an opportunity to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next sign is Qital al-Turk, which is warfare with the Turkic people. The Turkic people are a general ethnicity of people from the Russian steppes, modern day countries of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia. These are all called the Turkic people. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in a hadith, لا تقوم الساعة حتى يقاتل المسلمون الترك قوما وجوههم كالمجان المطرقة يلبسون الشعر ويمشون في الشعر. The hour will not come until the Muslims fight these people. They are people whose face is like tanned leather. They wear hair and their shoes are made out of hair. And this is the description of the Mongol people. I had a little bit of a longer story here, but we've covered it before. It's something that is crucial for our ummah to read and revisit. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century. It starts with Genghis Khan in the year 1206, and he begins by attacking the Khwarezmian Empire, which is modern-day Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. One of the largest empires of the Muslim Ummah at the time. And he attacks this nation and he burns it to the ground. Cities like Samarkand, Tashkent, Nishapur, Mir, Bukhara, he goes to them one by one and leaves a trail of destruction and bloodshed and brutality that this Ummah never saw before, nor did it ever see again. Everything that we've seen in the last few decades pales in comparison to what he did and his descendants did in the Muslim Ummah for the first half of the 13th century. from 1200 to about 1255. So, and it's not just him, but his descendants as well. And it's super important to always revisit this story, because the Muslim Ummah, like I was saying earlier, with your point of view dominating everything, that the little that you know, dominating your experience, you need to broaden your horizon to realize a few things. But very quickly, I know we've done it before, but it's super important to revisit until you memorize it, until it's engraved in your minds, in the forefront of your experience and the lens through which you view what happens to the Ummah now. In the early 1200s, like I said, they invade Muslim lands, they destroy the Khwarizmian Empire, which is one of the largest Muslim empires in existence at the time. And they make a level of brutality and killing. You can read it in the history of Ibn al-Athir, who was a historian that witnessed these things. How they destroyed these cities one by one. They violated the people. They turned the masajid into clubs, into bars. They used the crates of the Quran to feed their animals and had their animals trample the Qurans. And they gathered all the people, all the townspeople, to the places where they used to pray Eid, and separated them, males from females, and then began to behead them until they made a pyramid of male skulls and a pyramid of female skulls. Sheikh Mohammad, we don't need the AC. We're good. No AC. Jazakallah khairan. It's November. So the trail of destruction that they left is something that Muslims should revisit, because you constantly think that this is the worst that it gets or the worst that it ever was, and it clearly is not. And Ibn Athir, he writes in his own memoirs, in his own history, that they killed between 3 to 5 million Muslim civilians. Can you imagine in a few decades? If you do the math, when you go to these different cities, and the amount of time that they spent there, and the amount of death toll in each city one by one, the hundreds of thousands, you will find that they killed an average of 30 people per minute. Can you imagine? In a time where there are no bombs, there are no guns, one by one putting them to the sword or setting them on fire or strangling them. And he says about this, لَقَدْ بَقِيتُ عِدَّةَ سِنِينَ مُعْرِضًا عَنْ ذِكْرِ هَذِهِ الْحَادِثَةِ اسْتِعْظَامًا لَهَا كَارِهًا لِذِكْرِهَا فَأَنَا أُقَدِّمُ إِلَيْهِ رِجْلًا وَأُؤَخِّرُ أُخْرَى. People told me to document this as the historian that witnessed this. And for years I tried to, but I couldn't, out of the extent of this calamity. Every time I put one foot forward, I take one back. Every time I start writing, I stop. I'm not interested in going any further. فَمَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَسْهُلْ عَلَيْهِ نَعْيَ الْإِسْلَامَ وَالْمُسْلِمِينَ. Because who would find it easy to document the death of Islam and the Muslims? Nobody finds it easy scrolling past feeds and reels of dying people and mourning families. He's saying, I don't want to record this, but I know that I have to. And then he says, فَيَا لَيْتَ أُمِّي لَمْ تَلِدْنِي وَيَا لَيْتَنِي مِتُّ قَبْلَ هَذَا وَكُنْتُ نَسْيًا مَنْسِيًّا. I would have so much preferred that my mother never gave birth to me, that I died long before this and was forgotten, as opposed to having to witness these events. Because he sees it, and you see it from his writing, he says, this is the end. The day of judgment is tomorrow. That was 600 years ago. That was over 600 years ago. It's almost 800 years ago that he's documenting these words and his feelings. Then he didn't even get to witness the fall of Baghdad. He dies before that. Another epic, crushing blow to the Muslim Ummah that it literally never recovered from. This was the capital, and the first time and the only time in all Islamic history where a Khalifa is killed by an invading army. Imagine if he witnessed that, how much his hope would have even plummeted further. And then if you fast forward 40 years from his writing, and Genghis Khan dies, his descendant Halaqa Khan becomes the ruler, and he continues. There's a small reprieve where the Muslim Ummah takes a break as they decide who will be the next ruler, but the Mongols are back within a year or two. And they come to every single empire, every single kingdom one by one, and they destroy it. All the way from the Khwarizm Empire, which was the furthest east, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, these areas, all the way to Syria and Palestine. So the entire Muslim Ummah. The only reason they didn't go south to the Arabian Peninsula was Mecca and Medina, because there was nothing there. It was just a desert. They were never significant cities in terms of population or ruling the Ummah or economy center, so they had no interest in going there. So now they get all the way to the last frontier on the western front, which is the Kingdom of Egypt. After Egypt, there are no Muslim kingdoms. It's separated lands. At this point, Spain is all in tatters as well. It used to be one khilafah, now it's in pieces. So there's no Muslim kingdom left except for the Mamluk kingdom in Egypt. And they get there and they have a messenger come to the king, whose name was Saifuddin Qutuz, and he presents him with a letter that says, from the king of kings of the east, the great Khan, to Qutuz the Mamluk, who fled to escape our swords. You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast areas, massacring all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows are sharp, our swords are like thunderbolts. Our hearts are as hard as the mountains, and our soldiers are as numerous as the sand. Fortresses will not detain us, nor armies will stop us. Your prayers to God will not avail against us. We're not moved by tears or touched by lamentations. We're not only those who beg our protection will be safe. Hasten your reply before the fire of war is kindled. Resist and you will suffer the most terrible catastrophes. We will shatter your mosques and reveal the weakness of your God. Then we will kill your children and your old men at the same time. At present, you're the only enemy whom we have to march. We're free for you. They're not just fronting. They're not just being arrogant. They actually did all of this. And they would have the khatibs in the next town over be giving the khutbah. They would force them to give the khutbah before they got there, that the Mongols cannot be resisted. Lay down your weapons. And people wouldn't even fight. People wouldn't do anything. That there's more than one story that they would come to a town and they would leave only 1 or 2 or 3 Mongols in that whole town, and they'd keep going, and those 2 or 3 would execute the entire town. People would literally get in line and wait their turn. That's how helpless the ummah was at that time. The people were absolutely defeated. So they present this letter to the king Qutuz, and he gathers his advisors. And he tells them, what can we do? What's our options? So they tell him, if we can appease them, if we go before them in a matter of appeasement, seeking protection, relinquishing the fight, we wouldn't be blamed. Who can blame us after what they've done? So if you decide that, we will agree. If you decide to stand before them as a king and say, I give up my kingdom, I relinquish any resistance, as long as you guys keep going and leave us alone, you wouldn't be blamed. This is his advisor saying, we won't turn against you if you do that. And he tells them, do they keep their promises? People did that before. They begged for amnesty. Where are they now? They died anyway. So there's only one road for us, which is to die fighting. That we're not going to lay down our arms. This is not what our deen teaches us. And they start to argue. And then he tells them, أَنَا أَلْقَ التَّتَارِ بِنَفْسِي, I will stand alone. I will go face them by myself if you want to sit here arguing. يَا أُمَرَاءَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ لَكُمْ زَمَانْ تَأْكُلُونَ مِنْ بَيْتِ الْمَالِ وَأَنْتُمْ لِلْغُزَاةِ كَارِهُونَ. He says, O leaders of the Muslims, this council here in front of me, how long have you been eating, taking a salary from the Muslim treasury, while you sit here in fear about facing your enemy? How dare you? That salary that you take, that food that you eat that's from Muslim wealth, that is with the authority and the responsibility to protect the ummah. It's not for free. And then he tells them, I'm going, whether you come with me or not. And whoever chooses jihad, then let him come with me. And whoever chooses this world, let him go home. But let him know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees him, and that all the dishonoring of the young woman that happens is in his neck. You know what these people do. That's in your neck. You're not going to sleep comfortably with this blame being on you, what they do to our innocent women and children. And then he moves them by his insistence. They step out and they cut the messengers in half. And they put them on the gates of Cairo to let the Mongols know how serious the reply is. In a few months, the Mongols make it to Palestine. And the Mamluk Egyptians, they march north and they meet them at Ain Jalut, which is tens of kilometers, couple of miles maybe from Gaza today. And they stand in front of them there on the 25th of Ramadan. And they face down with an army that never in its history was stopped from accomplishing its goal. In the last 50 years, they were known that any goal, any city, they never were turned back. This was their reputation. And they stand in front of them there and they begin the battle. And in the midst of the battle, he sees that the left side of the army is collapsing. The rows are breaking. The formation is breaking. Once the formation breaks, that's it. The whole army falls apart. So he rushes forward to reinforce it. And as he's going forward, an arrow hits his horse and he falls off. So he begins to rush forward on foot, and they tell him, "O king, if you die, what leader is left for this ummah? If you die, there's no Muslim leader anymore. You're the last person in the entire ummah that commands leadership. So at least take one of our horses. Don't go on foot. You can't go on foot in the midst of people on horses. You're a sitting duck." And he tells them, "I will not deny a Muslim cavalryman from his horse. He needs it. If I have to take it, that means he has to be at disadvantage, and that's not how it works. I will not take an advantage at the risk of someone else having a disadvantage." So they say, "What happens if you die then? Who will be for the Muslim woman and the children that you spoke so passionately about?" And he said, "As for me, I'll be in Jannah." It's that simple. That's what it all comes down to, king or not. "And as for the women and children, Allah will take care of them, because Allah is the one who's taking care of this ummah, not me." And he rushes forward and he calls out to the entire army, "Wa Islama, for the sake of our deen." And the left flank solidifies, and it's the Mongols for the first time in their history who are crushed to pieces. They flee in the thousands, and his commanders follow them until they get to a field of reeds that they can't follow, so they set it aflame until they all burn to death. Because as the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man la yarham la yurham." Those who do not show mercy do not deserve mercy to be shown to them. And this battle rings in stories across the entire ummah, and people start to dispose of their Mongol emissaries and dignitaries that were ruling the cities and execute them. It created a domino effect where everyone woke up. Why are we saying this story, even though it's a much longer story and there's a lot more pieces that we're skipping over? For a few reasons. Number one is what we said weeks ago when the Prophet ﷺ made that dua. This ummah will never die. It doesn't matter how close it's brought to the brink of destruction. It doesn't matter if it looks like a pile of ash. There will always be embers in there that are just waiting for a very short time, for just a little bit of fuel to be rekindled, to illuminate the world again. It will never die. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "I made a dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never allows an outside enemy to subjugate this ummah, and He gave me that. It will never be brought to destruction by an outside enemy." Another thing is the hopelessness of Ibn al-Athir and people like him. You can't blame them after what they witnessed, but he was wrong. He said, "Who would find it easy to write the obituary of Islam and the Muslims?" No one will find it easy. Not because it's a difficult thing to do, but because nobody will write it. When Islam and the Muslims are over, this dunya will come to an end. But there's not a single person who will be left behind and say there used to be something called Islam and Muslims. That will never happen. Another point that we should focus on that will probably take longer to trace back historically, but what was Saifuddin Qutuz doing in Egypt in the first place? He's not Egyptian. He's from the same exact lands as the Mongols themselves. How did he end up all the way in Egypt, let alone its king? That was set by the Mongols themselves with the original invasion of Genghis Khan. When he goes, the first empire that he hits is the Khwarezm Empire. And Saifuddin Qutuz is actually the children of one of the noblemen, one of the princes. So when they kill everyone, they take the princes and they sell them into slavery to further humiliate them. So he ends up being sold as a slave from 1220, bouncing around the ummah for a few decades, till he ends up as a slave in Egypt, becoming one of the elite warrior class that were trained as warriors and generals. Political things happen left and right that maybe we could dissect another time, but they end up the kings of Egypt. And when his ancestors, his forefathers 1 or 2 generations ago, when they faced the Mongols, they had an opportunity to succeed, but they fought over worldly things. They fought over leadership. They fought over spoils. They fought over dividing the land. And in that weakness, the Mongols killed all of them when they had an opportunity to stand against them briefly. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set the plan for the Mongols being stopped with their very first invasion. They are the ones who pushed that first domino that leads to the Mamluks coming to Egypt, the ones who were ruling at the time, and then facing off with them in 1255 or 1260 it was. They are the ones themselves who set the course of action that led to the people who will stand against them over 50 years later. But with Qutuz himself, 38 years later with his selling into slavery. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is planning. It is the oppressor's own actions. When he steps on the gas, that's to a cliff, nowhere else. It doesn't head to anywhere that will please him. His own actions, their own actions, will lead to their demise. The people who stood against them were sold into slavery by them initially. That's how they end up in this different land. And it is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they become Muslim and take Islam more seriously than their masters that purchased them. And so He gave them the authority. This is really a brief summary. If you read the actual story, if you follow the steps, the different battles that take place, it is something out of fiction, stranger than fiction. But it's a reminder that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in absolute control. The last thing I want to mention is that He says, I wish I was never born to see these times. That's not for me and you to say ever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His infinite knowledge and wisdom and mercy chose to put you here and now. In 2024, with the ummah looking the way that it looks. With it suffering in so many different places. With countless open wounds. He chose to put you here and now. Why? That's for you to ask. It's not for you to despair. It's not for you to say this is the end of the ummah. You have no right to say that. You have no knowledge. You have no authority. He put you here for a reason. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to be the catalyst for change? Remember when we said all these signs are generally negative, but they're not to be taken complacently that this is just how things are. You were put here and given this awareness and given this information to do something differently. The next sign is a mix of things. Yes, Yusuf. Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. What? It was in 1260, Ramadan 25, 1260, which is... No, it's 1260 Gregorian. The next sign is a mix of signs where he mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, eras of deception. A time in which it will be very dark. And there's multiple signs mentioned in one, but he mentions them together that they're occurring at the same time. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, سَيَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ سَنَوَاتٌ خَضَّعَاتٌ. They will come upon the people very deceptive years, an era of deception. يُكَذَّبُ فِيهَا الصَّادِقُ وَيُصَدَّقُ فِيهَا الْكَاذِبُ وَيُؤْتَمَنُ فِيهَا الْخَائِنُ وَيُخَوَّنُ فِيهَا الْأَمِينُ وَيَنْطِقُ الرُّوَيْبِضَةُ قِيلَ وَمَا الرُّوَيْبِضَةُ قَالَ الرَّجُلُ التَّافِهُ يَتَكَلَّمُ فِي أَمْرِ الْعَامَّةِ. He said they will come across the people eras of deception, very dark times. The truthful will be considered a liar, and the liar will be considered truthful, and the trustworthy will be considered dishonest, and the dishonest will be considered trustworthy. Everyone's scales will be upside down. How they perceive people, how they perceive morals will be completely upside down. And he said then the base man will talk, a man who's very base, very low. And they said, who is that man? He said, a person with low aspirations, someone of this worldly life that will speak in the affairs of all people and be listened to. In another hadith describing these times, he said, the authority will be given to those who least deserve it. The worst of people will be their leaders. They'll be elected to positions. They'll be taken as an authority. He mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, specific signs as well that would happen in these eras, which is min ashrat as-sa'a an yurfa al-ilm wa yathbut al-jahl. Knowledge will be less common. Knowledge will be lifted from people and ignorance will prevail. Such that the people will eventually get to a point where all they know is the word Allah. So that's how we'll get to eventually, but that won't happen overnight. As he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in another hadith, because they said, how would that happen? Would people just simply forget their knowledge? And he said, that's not how it goes. What happens is the scholars will die, the people of knowledge will die, and they will not have anyone to replace them. No one will strive to take their place, to learn their legacy, and be passing that down. And you might think like, oh, that's something eventual, right? But I've actually met people like this here in America, where we're speaking about Islam, and I was doing it from a da'wah perspective. Let me do da'wah to these people. They're asking questions. They must be interested. They said, no, we're Muslims. I thought they were just joking. Like, just saying, no, we're already Muslims, just trolling me. So I was like, oh, really? Like, I didn't know how to react to that. Like, if it was a joke. And I said, no, we are. So I was like, where are you from? They told me where they're from. And they said, all we know is this. And they pull out a chain necklace that says the name Allah on it. That, and we don't eat pork. They didn't even say anything else. Don't eat pork, and this is the name of God. Literally, that is it. And a lot of them come from Eastern European countries where communism was very strong and completely obliterated the deen. They said, we have a masjid in our town that's chained and locked 365 days a year. No one enters it. It's just like a cultural building. They have no semblance of Islam left, and no one reached them to do da'wah or to remind them. They just know that this is all that there is for their religious commitment or their understanding of deen. And this, as the scholars have said, will be greater in the later times, where the remnants of people, of Muslims, that's all that they will have literally, which is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because in one hadith, they asked the Prophet ﷺ, what will that benefit them if they just know the name Allah? And he said that will save them from the fire. That's enough to earn them salvation from the fire. Why? That's all they know. That's all that's available. There's no salah, there's no zakah, there's no hajj, there's no any type of Islamic knowledge that they can access and be able to implement. So this hasn't happened just yet, but the extent where people forget the entirety of the deen, that is prevalent in many places of the world, sadly. In another hadith, he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, يَتَقَارَبُ الزَّمَانِ وَيُقْبَضُ الْعِلْمِ وَتَظْهُرُ الْفِتَنِ وَيُلْقِ الشُّحْ وَيَكْثُرُ الْهَرَجِ. Time will be in close proximity. It will be shorter. There's a lot of interpretations to this. We're going to get to it next week, inshallah. Knowledge will be lifted, and tribulations will be prevalent all over. People will be going through tribulations. And they will be extremely miserly. People will be super cheap with their wealth. And then he said, and there will be an increase of haraj. They told him, what is haraj? He said, killing. Killing in a widespread fashion, people massacring one another. He said, to the extent where the killer will not know why he's killing, and the one who is killed does not know why they are killed. In one narration, he said the killer and the victim are in the hellfire. They said, why? He said, because they are both keen on killing one another. So many conflicts in recent history where, what's the purpose of them? Right? Who's pulling the strings? What is the benefit? All those people who make those decisions are in suits somewhere, safe at home, and then the soldiers kill one another. Or they kill civilians. And on large scales, in huge numbers, right, with absolutely no concern for innocence or justice. He said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in another hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَقْبِضُ الْعِلْمَ انْتِزَاعًا يَنْتَزِعُهُ مِنَ الْعِبَادِ وَلَكِنْ يَقْبِضُ الْعِلْمَ بِقَبْضِ الْعُلَمَاءِ حَتَّى إِذَا لَمْ يَبْقَ عَالِمًا اتَّخَذَ النَّاسُ رُؤُوسًا جُهَّالًا فَسُئِلُوا فَأَفْتَوْا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ فَضَلُّوا وَأَضَلُّوا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't remove knowledge from people by pulling it out of their minds or out of their hearts. But He does that by taking the souls of the scholars. They die naturally until there's not a single scholar left. And the people will then take their leaders as ignorant fools. They will be asked and they will answer without knowledge. So they will misguide themselves and misguide others. Or we spoke about the severity of speaking without knowledge. Especially in a time where this has not happened yet, where knowledge is available, is actually more available than it ever was before. He said in another hadith, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that it will get to the point where the people, like we said, will take their leaders as the most ignorant of them. حتى يقال عن الرجل ما أظرفه ما عقله ولا في قلبه حب ذرة من إيمان. Until they take a leader and they look at this person, they say, look at how impressive he is. Look at his intellect. Look at how much he has to offer. But he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in reality, there's not a speck of faith in his heart. Who do people revere now today? Who do they look up to? Posted on their walls. Classes of athletes or entertainers, celebrities, artists, sports players, Elon Musk. People who in reality have very little to offer humanity. And in fact, in them is most of what's wrong with people. The majority of them are pedophiles, drug addicts, psychopaths, rapists, the whole thing. It's constantly coming out news about them. Scandal after scandal. This is who they are. This is what their society and their prestige and their power and their wealth, this is where they all invest it in. And it's constantly, one generation after the other, these things being exposed, and people still follow them. Right? Even amongst Muslims, you have people who idolize them, who consider them role models. It's the blind leading the blind. The Muslim is a lot wiser than that. Doesn't really take any leadership or any direction from someone who has nothing to offer. Is constantly looking for those who are aware of their purpose and who are offering them anything connected with their purpose and their ability to disengage from this worldly life and focus on the hereafter. In these dark times, in these eras of deception, he described ﷺ specifically forces of oppression. And listen to how he described them. He said ﷺ يكون في هذه الأمة في آخر الزمان رجال أو يخرج رجال من هذه الأمة في آخر الزمان معهم صياط كأنهم أذناب البقر يغدون في سخط الله ويروحون في سخط الله. Towards the ends of time, there will be groups of men who have whips in their hands like the tails of cattle. They exit under the displeasure of Allah, and they go back home in the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, striking the people and oppressing them. What does that sound like? Groups of men whose job it is to go around beating people, and they only function in the displeasure of Allah, everything that they do. In another hadith, he gave them a name that if I say it, you'll know exactly what he's talking about. But in this one, he just says groups of men. Any takers? Huh? Everyone here was thinking cops. In another hadith, he said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, shurat. Shurtatun. He gave that the name, which is the Arabic word for police forces. He said there will be police forces who are given authority and weapons, and they'll go around beating people. They exit under the wrath of Allah, and they go back home in His anger. There are people whose very lives is bent on one purpose, which is oppression of people. And as much as people may not like to hear it, that's the only reason why police exist all over the world in all history, even Islamic history. They were never peacekeepers. They were never upholding the law. These were secondary or tertiary purposes and objectives. They were there and they were created for only one reason in all history, even Islamic history: to keep the ruling class in power, to fulfill their commands, to make sure that they do what they are told as the ruling class that pays them ordains. Tax collectors is one example. This is the only reason. Check out every history of every police force ever. It's the only reason they ever existed. Where they were picked from, who was picked, the kind of education that they go through. Yes? So a lot of police forces in America were created as a means of hunting slaves and sending them back to the original masters. That's why they were created. That's in their very inception. Does that mean every single person in their midst is evil? It's not what I'm saying. But then he told us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if you're able to, do not join their forces. This is a hadith. It says, لا تكونوا في بطانتهم. Don't be amongst them if you can. This isn't a fatwa not to become a cop, but it's something to think about. For all the people that join these forces worldwide, what do they represent? What are they made to do? Whether that person who joins them is good or bad or uses it for good and evil, that's a different story. But these forces only exist for one purpose. And that's why you will see there's no type of organization like this where you'll find a righteous Muslim amongst them, or if he's righteous, he's slowly forced out. He will never climb to the top. They'll never allow someone who takes Islam seriously as a way of life to gain any traction in these organizations, even in Muslim countries. Period. Because they don't exist for Islam. They exist for a completely different reason. There's tons of hadith. We can go over them a later time. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in part of these dark times, and we'll end with these two, intishar az-zina, وانتشار الربا, that fornication, adultery, and usury will be widespread. And this hadith leads to it from the previous one. He said, صنفان من أهل النار لم أرهما قوم معهم سياط كأذناب البقر يضربون به الناس. It's not the right hadith. He said, two groups of the people of the hellfire that have not yet witnessed. The first of them is what we just said, these forces of men with whips like the tails of cattle that they strike people with. And the second group is mumilat, ma'ilat. They are women who are clothed yet naked. And they are swaying in their walk, swaying in their speech. They entice people to them. And he mentioned this as a precursor to the dhuhur az-zina, for the prevalence of fornication. That people's morals will begin to melt. Their standards of manners will melt away as well. And then it will lead to a prevalence of zina. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, تَشِيعَ فِيهَا الْفَاحِشَةِ. In these evil dark times, there will be a widespread acceptance of zina and illicit morality and actions. People are okay with it. It's completely normal. And these are things, again, that we see happen before our very eyes. And the last hadith that we'll mention today is that he mentioned the riba being widespread until it is a part of every single transaction. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whoever does not engage in riba directly, then his money will have ghubar al-riba, it will have the dust of riba on it. Think about yourselves here. If you have money and you don't deal with riba yourself, you've never taken it and you've never paid it, inshallah none of you ever will. But where do you put your money? It's in the bank. Everything they do is with riba. The person who's paying you, do they engage in riba? Most definitely, if you live in the world. So you're not blameworthy for that, because you did what you could. But that wasn't always the case. Right? People back in the day, if they earned their own hard-earned gold or silver or cattle, and that wasn't from riba, that's it. There's no semblance of riba that gets to them. But nowadays, that's literally impossible. Whoever paid you is dealing with riba, and if not, then whoever paid them. There's no way you're going to go up one or two, follow that dollar, one or two levels up from how it came to you, except you're going to find that riba was involved. You yourself have to put in a bank. You're not going to go bury it under a tree somewhere. There's only so much space in your pillow or under your bed. So you're going to have to put it in an institute, and all those institutes, as soon as they get it, they invest it. That's how banks make their money. So you're not blameworthy for that, but it is a sign of the times, as he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that this will be the case, and everyone's money will be touched by riba in one way, shape, or form. So there's a few other hadith that we'll cover inshallah next week about the widespread evil that will happen and how it's going to be similarly as with the other hadith in stages. That's not always manifest the way that we see it in front of us to the maximum level, but it's definitely something that we see in our society today. So what do you do? Do you just say, oh, we're in such evil times and there's nothing that I could do? And what is the formula for you to survive if this is what you're surrounded by? So stay at home is not something that is absurd. In fact, there's many ahadith that says in some of these times the best of person is a man or a woman with their flock of sheep in the middle of nowhere. They eat from them, they drink from them, and that's all they have. And in one hadith he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you run away from these times, from these settings, even if it means that you have to, like to the time of Dajjal for example, even if it means that you have to bite on the roots of trees. You're barely getting any nutrition, you're starving to death. So there is merit to that. But there's other hadith where he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the person that mixes with the people and is patient upon their harm and their evil is better than the one that isolates. So which hadith is it? What are we going to do? Do you run away? How do you mix it? So there's definitely a mix that you could do where you're involved in society but you have your own refuge to seclude yourself. And then as Musa said as well, it's important to have a self-awareness. What's best for you? Someone who's drowning in it all, who's completely submerged in it, who's unable to present any resistance, who's failing on every single front, maybe seclusion would be better for them. A tempered seclusion. And someone else who's able to navigate as much as the struggle is, maybe it's their job to navigate. Not everyone can seclude. Not everyone could just disappear. Can get up and move to another country. What country will you go to, first of all? That's a whole other question. But it's important to gauge yourself, to have a level of self-awareness and know what's best for you. The absolute loser, the person who's guaranteed to lose, is the person who's living their life willy-nilly, just walking about and with no type of perception or contemplation over these things. Who's just living a normal life, saying, I'm going to have a family, I'm going to procreate, I'm going to have a home, and I'm going to live just a normal life, like this life is the end-all be-all. That person is just waiting to be caught by one of these things, caught off guard. Where he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the person would awaken a believer and by nightfall will be a disbeliever, or go to sleep a believer and by morning would be a disbeliever, selling their deen for a piece of this world, for a worldly benefit, a worldly commodity. Someone who's not aware of these things, who's not living their life, watching how things change, watching how these ahadith come to play before their very eyes, and having some kind of plan for themselves, for their family. What's going to keep my family's deen strong? What's going to protect them from haram influences? What situations am I creating for my children? If someone's not constantly thinking about these things, then that's how these all hadith apply to you. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you'll be caught in it like a wave. In another hadith, he said, تُعْرَضُ الْفِتَنُ عَلَى الْقُلُوبِ عُودًا عُودًا. We already mentioned this hadith, that the fitan will be presented to the hearts one straw after the other, like a basket, a weave. Before you can consider that one's been put down, the other one's already there on top of you. You don't have the ability even to gasp for air. So it's very important to be, number one, aware. Number two, he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, بَادِرُوا بِالْأَعْمَالِ. In the hadith that we started with a couple of weeks ago, he said, rush towards deeds. Don't be complacent. Don't say sometime later. If you're putting it off for later, you're procrastinating, you most likely will not make it. Whatever you learn, whatever you know, implement it now. Because when the time comes when things get really dark and you're struggling with matches, you're not going to see anything. You're not going to know what hit you. You won't be able to gain your footing before things change again. And the next fitna comes. And then you're unable to even gain any bearings or have any direction over where you go. Another hadith, he told us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-ibadatu fil haraj kal-hijratu ilay. That worship in these times of intense tribulations, the same times that we're describing and we'll continue describing inshallah next week, worship in these times, intensifying your worship, increasing in it, is like making hijrah to me. It's like going to join the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he told the Sahaba that there will be people who come after you, that the worship of one of them is the reward of 50. And they said, 50 of us or 50 of them? He said, no, 50 of you. It's going to be multiplied several times over, the reward that they get, the benefit that they get. And they said, why? How's that fair? Like, we're working really hard here. He said, you have that which will aid you. You have the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam right here live amongst you in your midst, receiving revelation and telling you what to do or not to do. They will have nothing. They'll be forced to go against the tide in every single decision, every single act of worship, every single way that they dress, every single culture that they try to adopt. It will always be against the tide. And so Allah will multiply their rewards to accommodate for the difficulty of what they're going through. We mentioned last week the hadith of, he said sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the one that's holding on to their deen will be like the one that's doing what? Holding on to a burning coal. And how do you do that? You have to. Can't juggle, no. It's always the answer. It's a weird one. Yeah, Ahmed. The consequences of letting go are worse than the consequences of holding on. It is painful to hold on. It does take a lot of work. It is going to be tumultuous. It's not going to be smooth. But letting go is so much worse. Letting go of that burning coal is so much more painful. The consequences are so much beyond your hand being burned if you were to let go. So without that attitude, you will not make it. It's impossible to face these fitan. And there's so many more that we're going to go through. Where he mentioned commerce. The amount of trade that people will be doing and the effect that will have on pulling them away from their hereafter. It's going to completely engulf them in this world. He mentioned the amount of knowledge that people will have, but no wisdom. The accessibility of information. That everyone will be reading and writing. Things that were not commonplace in his time, but they're not mentioned positively, not because knowledge is bad. He's the one who commanded people to learn how to read and write and told them to teach each other, but it's because that will take the place of their purpose. So he mentioned all of these things to warn us. And that is the last point that I want to mention is in the face of all of this, all this evil, all these specific ahadith, how are you a form of resistance? How are you a form of saying, no, not on my watch, not in my family, not in my community? Or you're just going to lay down and let it happen. Oh, he foretold this, so it's bound to happen. That's exactly what the people did in the time of the Mongols. They said these people are Ya'juj and Ma'juj, one of the major signs of the day of judgment that we'll get to eventually. And the Prophet ﷺ foretold about them that what? They will kill everything, and what else? They cannot be fought. He said, ﷺ, when they come, you run because there's no fighting that can be done against them. Ya'juj and Ma'juj specifically. So there's no resistance that can be done to these against Ya'juj and Ma'juj. So people said, because the Mongols are decimating the Ummah, they must be Ya'juj and Ma'juj, so there's no point in fighting. When the Mongols said, surrender your weapons, they said, here you go. Even though they would send an emissary to collect the weapons before the army came. It's just one man taking their weapons, and they said, here you go. Because they're Ya'juj and Ma'juj. So they read into the times something incorrect, and that led to hopelessness and helplessness that led to all of them being slaughtered in the literal millions, 3 to 5 million Muslims over 50 years. When there's a ton of other hadith that clearly point out that they can't be Ya'juj and Ma'juj, it's impossible. Why? They come after Isa alayhi salam. He's going to be present when they're there. What happened to those ahadith? They just disappeared? People didn't read them? But they were so helpless and hopeless that they just latched on to anything that would feed into that. There's nothing that we could do. They chose that initially, so they twisted the text or they misunderstood them to the point where they were absolutely helpless and led to their own demise. So don't give in to helplessness. See each one of these signs. If zina will be everywhere, how can I be the furthest possible from it? If he mentioned certain actors of how they will dress and how they will talk and walk, how can I not be like that? If he mentioned riba will be everywhere and you cannot help but the dollar will be touched by riba somewhere up, fine, but not on my level. That's what our job is to do. When he said ignorance will be prevalent and no one will know anything, how can I make sure that I'm a vanguard against that? That I'm learning my deen, that I know it inside out, all the obligations, all the nooks and crannies that I need to survive in this world, and that I'm passing that on to my children and my community. So even if it is my time, even if this is describing my scenario, how can I be the exception? To the best of my ability. I can't stop it from happening, but I can make sure that it doesn't apply to me. That's the very least that we can do. These ahadith were not given to us for despair or complacency, but so that we can be wary, we can be aware that the day of judgment is ever approaching, always quicker, always on the horizon, and that we could do something differently at the very least on a personal level, but not just there. How can we help the ummah at large? How can we make these descriptions not apply in their totality? That's not in my time. These are things that should be driving forces for us to act. Inshallah, we'll call it a night here. Go ahead, Azi. You had a question?
Yeah, so my question was that it goes back to what you were saying about the no knowledge part. So during the time of the Mongols, if emissaries were coming from the Mongols, they had to go to the Islamic leaders of those lands.
Yes.
So that means that the Islamic leaders had to make the choice of handing over the weapons.
Yeah.
So then that means that were they really just trying to save their own butts? And they didn't care about the other people?
So they had different responses. Some of them tried to save themselves. Some of them organized safe passage for themselves and their families only and left the townspeople to die. Some of them did agree to, not everybody has weapons, right? It's not everyone is a soldier. Most people are just civilians, farmers, or whatever. But they would agree that the army would stand down. You will not face an army if you come to this city. Their army itself would not put up any defense. So they were either trying to save themselves, trying to negotiate safety, which the Mongols always betrayed or enslaved everybody. It never worked out.
But in those cities where these leaders make the decision, there had to be religious leaders there.
No, not at all. There wasn't always a religious leader or a scholar that was cared about. Nobody cares about these things in general. Huh? Not now, not then. Yeah. The scholars never had that authority in almost in any part of Islamic history. It's very rare from the very beginning, from the end of the time of the Sahaba, where the scholarly class had any influence close to what you're talking about. There's certain pockets for sure, but in general, no, not at all. The advisors are the worst of people. There should be, yes. It's an ideal, but it wasn't the case for the majority of our history. The scholars were doing scholarly work. They were teaching in the masajid, but they weren't in positions of authority. Very rarely. Sometimes, but very rarely. In these cases, if you go through the stories of the cities and the empires, the scholarly class, they would sometimes put up a resistance, but they couldn't command the armies. They couldn't tell people do this or do that. They couldn't rally the people. They didn't have that authority. And they almost never did. Yeah.
What do you mean by, just correct me if I'm wrong, the reading and writing, like it would be, not like the, I mean, close to against this, basically. I wasn't sure what you meant.
Well, we didn't get to that just yet, but he generally foretold that reading and writing will be prevalent. Everyone will read and write. And that's, in his time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that was not the norm across all of society. So some of them are just general hadith that saying that reading and writing will be prevalent. People will learn to read and write. And there's other hadith that tell us that knowledge will be everywhere. People will have access to information, but no wisdom. Meaning that reading and writing is not a positive thing. Like, what difference does it make in how they hold themselves, the purpose of their life? Nothing.
So basically, like, they'll have the knowledge, but they won't implement it.
They either won't implement it, or it's worldly, not purely just worldly knowledge and not of the hereafter. That's like the implications. So I apologize for the choppy nature. The notes bugged out, and then I was just reading from the source text, bouncing around it with whatever my eyes landed on. So thank you for your patience. Yes, sir. What about now? Yeah? So what's your question? What do we do? Well, so you have access to information. You have access to better yourself. Where are you in the standard of the deen that you know? That's enough to give all of us plenty of work day in and day out. That should be everyone's number one focus. How is my level of deen, my level of knowledge? Does that translate into action? Is that something that people benefit from? Is it something that cascades onto others? Am I an active force in undoing these things that I hear? The basic things that we just heard, the prevalence of zina, the prevalence of riba, the prevalence of ignorance. So you yourself being free of those things, these negative descriptions. And number two, you helping to rid others. If this masjid was filled to the brink from its top to the bottom and there wasn't space to sneeze, there would still be 95% of Muslims out there that don't come here. Over 95%, 90 to 95% of Muslims never enter a masjid in America. So how many Muslims are there in America? Forget America, in New York City. How many Muslims are there in New York City? Around 800,000. How many masajid are there? Huh? It's like 265, I think. That's counting the Shi'i ones and the Ahmadi ones, but we'll digress. Forget that. Let's say there's 250. Each one, if you look at their average capacities, is tens of people. And there's very few of them that have capacity for hundreds of people. So you add, let's say, 100 in each masjid, even though it's much less. Let's say 100 in each masjid. 100 times 250? 25,000. 25,000. You add, you make them separate than the people that come to Eid, and you add all the big Eids in New York City. You won't hit 100,000. That means over 700,000 Muslims, we never even see them. You never interact with them in your whole life. Where are they? 700 out of 800,000. Just by basic math. They're not here. They're not connected to the masjid. So there's your job, what to do in America, Yusuf. You have hundreds of thousands of Muslims in the 5 boroughs who you never ever see or interact with or teach Islam or hear about Islam or pray in the masjid or pray Jummah or pray Eid even. That's enough work for you for your entire lifetime. What? Yeah, is there a single masjid that fits 3,200 people? So it's not an issue of do they fit in the masjid. It's that my point was we never even interact with them whatsoever. They never come here. They never do anything that has to do with the community. Forget about the number. That's not the point. The point is that's your homework. What should we do here? That's what you should do here. Make that your life mission, and that's enough. That'll take you an entire lifetime. Sisters, go ahead. Can everybody in the back settle down, please, just so we could hear what people are asking? Jazakumullah khairan. Someone kick out that child. It's mine. It's fine. I can say that. What is the reasoning for that hadith that mixing with the people is better than being isolated for them? He said, someone who mixes with them and is patient upon their harm. So there's an overwhelming benefit in them, in this person, mixing with the people. And that's why, like the brother mentioned, it's a case-by-case basis. Maybe somebody finds that them mixing with the people, interacting with them, is harming them more than they're benefiting. That they themselves are being harmed and they're not being able to bring about benefit. Then maybe mixing is not better for them. And it's not a all or nothing. I mix with the people or I don't. It could be in certain scenarios, certain situations. That I don't go to this event because the benefit for me personally is less than the harm. Or I don't go to this gathering, or I don't mix with these certain people because the overwhelming harm is greater than anything that I benefit myself or them. So you do that cost-benefit analysis with every single time that you go anywhere or do anything in terms of mixing with people. Because he mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, specifically in evil times, that at times you could be overwhelmed. That you could mix with people, and because of that setting, it ends up harming you in your faith. So you make that cost-benefit analysis. I don't want anyone to disappear and say, well, I'm not mixing with the people because Muhammad said it's evil. No, gatherings like this, inshallah, will always be of greater benefit than harm. Where you're in a society like this, where you're constantly swimming against the current, you're going to need people around you. You will not make it alone. But that doesn't mean that you have to go to every single thing and always be mixing with people. You need alone time as well, right? You need time to fortify your own worship, your own knowledge. You need to work deeply in the sense that you are focusing on you and developing you in good blocks of time. So the balance is tough to achieve for sure, but that's your homework. That's what you must do. Find that balance and think about you and see what best benefits you and saves you from harm. But there's in the other hadith, as the scholars have mentioned, it's foretelling times where it's just completely evil. It's the absolute worst. And in those cases is where the hadith that the scholars mentioned, they apply where the best of people is someone who's completely on their own, their flock of animals, and they're just minding their business, worshipping Allah until they die. So those are times where, and they could have, again, occurred in certain pockets, but they're largely pointing towards, as the scholars have said, to times where there's overwhelming evil and there's no opportunity for good. And Allah knows best. Anybody else from this side? This guy. Nissan, KTL 1715. Here, take your phone. Toss it. It was your idea. Yeah. You have to walk in with a gun? If you have a savings account, doesn't that just make it a checking account?
It still operates differently because no one can hack into your savings account. If you buy your debit card, you get access to their checking account. But the point is, savings account, you get interest on it, you can turn it off. Just a lot of people don't know that.
You could turn off the interest on your savings account by going to the bank and signing some stuff and telling them, I don't want my... If they use the money, that's their business. Because there's literally no other solution. Can you take a few $1,000s even, maybe a few thousand, yeah, but can you take tens of thousands of dollars? Or the way that you receive checks and money, can you live without a bank? Is it safe? It's not, right? There's a lot of risk that's in there. You could probably. It's possible. I'm not saying it's completely impossible when I say it's not something you can do. When I say you can't do it, doesn't mean it's impossible. What I mean is you can't do it is you can't viably function like that. And Islam doesn't demand that you function like a caveman, for example, or in a world that completely inconveniences you, makes your life considerably harder. Islam doesn't demand that, especially when there's no viable halal options. So in this case, you'd be completely absolved by the fact that they invest your money in riba, they use your money for haram transactions, They get the sin for that. You're just simply putting the money you earn and then withdrawing it and using it in a halal fashion. You earn it halal, you spend it halal. And if there's any viable options or you come across something else, even Islamic banking. Even Islamic banking in certain countries that is Islamic, they use your money in halal ways. But where do they put their money? Where are they going to take $1 million from people or 5 million riyal or whatever? They have to put it into the greater system. They have no choice. So there's really no escape from it whatsoever unless you're going to bury money everywhere and, you know, like it's 1,000 years ago, which is not viable. It's not something the Muslim can viably do. So Islam doesn't demand that that be the solution. And it's just a sign of the times where there's nothing you could do about that in the greater system. But you personally, you don't earn riba, you don't spend riba, you don't sign off on it, you don't witness it, you stay as far away as possible. Yeah, Zach.
Also, I think the biggest thing is seeking knowledge because, like, in terms of riba, a lot of people, when they think of like banks, they're like,
When you think of what? Banks?
like just any financial institution, they're like, yo, like I can't work in that bank just because of riba, but if you like dive deeper, talk to shield and know more, or like consultations, like you'll find out there's some stuff that you can work in other banks.
Yeah, you need to be constantly seeking knowledge. Gatherings like this, seeking knowledge in your own individual effort at home so that you're well equipped to deal with the changing times as they get worse, as they get more difficult, as you encounter gray areas. What do I do in this situation, that situation? You have to be constantly tuned in to Islamic knowledge. Or else you're eventually going to make the wrong decisions and that will have devastating consequences. Yes, sir. So that's another example of like where it's almost impossible. Nowadays they have the Islamic banking system, for example. But even then, there's certain, it's not like purely halal. The only purely halal way to buy a house is to buy it straight up cash in modern day. But that's not something that people can viably do. Even the people who have the cash, it's not always a viable choice. In fact, most times it's not. Even if someone had $1 million and they were to buy a house straight up cash, would they be avoiding all the haram factors of riba and stuff? Yes, they would. Would it be commendable? Sure. Is it viable as an option for most people? No, it isn't. There's a lot of different details that make it a much harder option. So based on that, it's not one blanket fatwa that I can give you here. But in some cases, depending on your family makeup, your finances, that it could be okay to use some of these systems that even if they're less than ideal. Whether that's conventional banking, whether that's the Islamic mortgages or the Islamic banking as they're called, those are much better, of course, but they still have problems in their conditions, problems in their contracts. They're not pure. So there's no pure way to own a house except buying it cash. But then you could be absolved of the violations in that contract depending on your situation and why you're buying the house and a bunch of other things that you can go on AMJA's website, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America, and they had a whole conference about buying homes in America. They listed all these conditions, they listed all the details. It won't take you more than 15 minutes to read, and you should have a much better idea about buying a home here in America. And then from there, you go and you lay down your own situation in front of someone of knowledge, and they will guide you through what's halal and what's haram. But there's no clear-cut answer. Like, for some people, a conventional mortgage might be okay. And for some people, Islamic mortgage might be the way to go. And for some people, it's all differs depending on your situation. Yes? My notes? I just told you they messed up. I don't have them. I can send you the book if you want. It's not in English. Sure. I'll send it to you. I don't mind. I'm not gatekeeping. Sisters? Go ahead. Say it again. The book's name is Ashrat al-Sa'a. There's a couple of that I was using. The one that I was using now, just because my notes bugged out and I had no access to them, it's called Ashrat al-Sa'a by Yusuf al-Wabil. Ashrat al-Sa'a, The Signs of the Hour by Yusuf al-Wabil. No. What? The title, I translated it on the spot. It's not. But you'll find a lot of similar books in English and articles and video series. Sheikh Yasir Qadi has one that he uses this book to give. He says that in the beginning, so you can check that out. He doesn't cover as many signs as in the book, of course, and neither will we because it's a lot. But the book is about 500 pages, all about the signs of the Day of Judgment, the major and the minor ones. We're starting with the minor ones. We won't cover all of them. He mentions, I think, 57. We'll probably end up next week or the week after will be the end. We'll cover about 20 or 30 of them max. Probably 20. And then we'll move on to the major signs, inshallah. What? Yusuf al-Wabil. Yeah, Yusuf. No, already here makes no sense because we're still alive and there's a bunch of things that would happen before that hasn't happened yet. The worst thing you could do is just give in to complacency. Say there's nothing that I can do. Or to feel helpless or hopeless. Because that will be your personal destruction. The ummah will not be affected. It'll keep going. Just without you. You'll be left behind. Because you chose to say this was hopeless or nothing could change. So you're the only one who will miss out. You may harm some people immediately around you as well, but that won't last. The ummah will overcome and it will continue upon the set path. There's plenty of good signs as well that we'll get to, inshallah, in the coming weeks that are positive. The ummah will change, will have righteous leadership. So you'll miss out on all of that, or you won't be part of the building blocks. That's on you. Anybody who chooses to be complacent or to give up or to, be hopeless. So that's the most important thing that we could take away from this is don't be hopeless, don't give up. See how you can be a force in the opposite direction of everything that you're hearing. Even if there are things that are bound to continue and progress, whether we like it or not, because he foretold it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. At least in my existence, how can I stand against it and be a means of resisting it, making it harder for it to continue as opposed to being a means of letting it continue. There was a hand here, sister? So there's different scholars that have numbered them between like 50 to 100 even. A lot of them are kind of also overlapping. So right now, and what we just did at the end, I just kind of put a bunch of signs that were mentioned separately. They were numbered separately, like each one is on its own. And I kind of put them together because they're all concurrent at the same time, and they're all about just evil times that everything is going wrong. So I kind of just made it one thing just for ease of presentation. But in reality, in a lot of these books, they would mention each one separately. So that leads to like a large number, and they quote the same hadith for them. And some of them are also concurrent with the major signs. Because when the major signs come, there's still minor signs that happen in between them, as we'll mention. So that ends up for it being a difficult timeline to follow. And we're just mentioning, it's a summary at the end of the day. It's not meant to be an exhaustive class of every single minor sign. But we'll cover all the major ones, inshallah. The book covers as many as he could find. That was the whole point of the whole book. So he goes over as many of them. It's not even like a crazy deep dive. There's people who have done more details. He tried to keep it brief within 500 pages for all of it. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. Inshallah, we will continue next week with more of the minor signs. And maybe next week or the week after that will be the last of the minor signs before we move on to the major ones, inshallah, about 2 weeks. For all the people here who are single and lonely, we've partnered up officially with We've partnered up with In Pairs here, which is a service and organization aimed at helping people find halal marriage. So part of it will be facilitated by the center. Most of it will be facilitated by this organization. The official launch is on December 1st. So now you can sign up for the wait list. And you go to this link. And they're giving a random prize, I don't know what it is, to people who sign up on the wait list. So that sounds like incentive. And it's not going to be like, all these other apps where you just scroll through profiles. Not at all. You put up your profile. They only show your profile to people that you match with according to what you choose. And then from there, you choose to go on or not. And there's a level of facilitation that will be presented by this masjid here. That will try to facilitate it. That if people match with each other, we'll try to facilitate their communication with each other and things like that. So this is to help the community in terms of the way that it usually works, which is just throwing it out there and hoping your parents find someone or your uncle finds someone or whatever. That doesn't seem to be working for most people. So we're hoping that this will be a good alternative that is not, again, where people are scrolling past each other's profiles and looking at each other, that is more conducive to these other apps and that what they do, and it has a lot of issues. So this, your profile is only shown when there's a match according to what you said you wanted, according to what you said you're looking for. And then from there, you can bring it here and we'll help you communicate, we'll help you facilitate it depending on what you get from this app, from this organization, that you can match with up to 3 people per month. So there's only up to 3 matches per month, up to. You may not match with anyone depending on the pool of people available and what they're looking for. But if you match up to 3 people per month, you choose, and then we help facilitate your communication and hopefully help people get married in a halal fashion as opposed to everything that's going on here. So definitely do sign up. Their launch is again on December 1st, and there's an incentive, a prize that will be selected for people who sign up or at random, one of the people who sign up from now until then. جزاكم الله خيرا everyone. سبحانك وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. صلى الله وبارك على